Hi guys, this is Daryl and welcome back to Book Odyssey. Today I'm going to be looking at new space opera and how it's changed from the classic heyday of science fiction's golden age. Up until the late 1950s, one of the most popular types of science fiction was the pulp era space opera. These were often bombastic, galaxy-spanning space adventures that featured impossible science, colossal weapons, interstellar wars and galactic empires in a grandiose style adventure. Early works of what would later become known as space opera include Robert William Cole's The Struggle for Empire, published in 1900, which depicts an interstellar conflict between the people of Earth and a fierce humanoid race headquartered on Sirius. While this has been credited as being the first space opera, one of the early examples of the classic pulp-style space operas can be seen in The Skylark of Space, written by Edward E. Smith, published in 1928, which follows Dr. Richard Seaton after he commercializes his discovery of a revolutionary power source that will enable interstellar flight. Despite these stories existing for decades, it wasn't until 1941 that the term space opera was first used. When the author Wilson Tucker first coined it, however, it was meant as a derogatory term. For many writers, the pulpy space opera era of sci-fi's history was something they believed they had to distance themselves from, rather than celebrate. With the emergence of the 1960s new wave, sci-fi writers experimented with a more literary style, and then later in the 1980s, with the emergence of cyberpunk, sci-fi became edgy, stylish and teetering on the brink of paranoia as it waded into the 90s. Throughout these epochs in science fiction, the space opera didn't vanish completely. What happened was a reinvention into a new type of space opera, one that retained from the classic style the sense of adventure on the grandest possible scale, but offered characters that were more complex and more ambiguous than the somewhat cardboard-style protagonists people were used to. Among some writers, this also meant the opportunity to write more politically driven fiction, along with an often left-leaning radicalistic slant that possibly sought to actively contrast with what was seen by some as the militaristic, colonialist attitudes of the classic space opera story. According to Scottish sci-fi writer Ken MacLeod, who was a major contributor of what became known as the new space opera in the 1990s, the new space opera first began in 1975 with M. John Harrison's The Century Device. Harrison reportedly thought of the Century Device as an anti-space opera, which follows the adventures of a 24th century space captain named John Tuck. This morally ambiguous character was not above drug smuggling and other illegal activities in his quest to roam the galaxy looking for work. Unlike the gung-ho heroes of traditional space opera, Truck is anything but a typical hero in this desolate and immoral future, where the two remaining superpowers on Earth are the Israeli world government and the United Arab Socialist Republics, representing offshoots of capitalism and socialism, while organised crime is rampant throughout the galaxy. Add to this a creepy religious cult called the Openers and an alliance of art-loving spacefarers called the Interstellar Anarchists, and you can see that we have many elements that make up much of today's new space opera. Morally ambiguous characters, political and social upheaval, and religious extremism. Sci-fi writer Ken MacLeod said Harrison's The Century Device turned out to be exactly the sort of thing a group of sci-fi writers were looking for. A new direction in science fiction which wasn't just another offshoot of the emerging cyberpunk movement. We enjoyed the scope and ambition of classic space opera, but disliked the cardboard characters and the American chauvinism. We admired the freight and density of new wave writing, but despaired the unsympathetic characters and British pessimism. The Century Device was Harrison's first foray into the new space opera format, and he returned to it more than 20 years later, writing a trilogy of novels that began with Light in 2002, Nova Swing in 2006, and Empty Space in 2012, all featuring morally ambiguous characters and all connected to a mysterious region in space called the Kefahuchi Tract. Many cite Harrison's Kefahuchi Tract series as being one of the most complex literary achievements of the whole new space opera movement, and it's used as an example of how the new space opera differs from the idealistic futures of the heroic space captains of classic space opera. And when it comes to new space opera, a few big hitters emerged in the 1990s and early noughties, taking the subgenre into the heights of popularity. Writers like Stephen Baxter, Paul Macaulay, Dan Simmons, Alistair Reynolds, Ian M. Banks, and Peter F. Hamilton all shaped the landscape of science fiction. Paul Macaulay said that the new space opera cheerfully plunders the toys and tropes of the school and secondary sources, from James Blish to Samuel R. Delany, refurbishes them with up-to-the-minute science, and deploys them in epic narratives where intimate human-scale stories are at least as relevant as the widescreen baroque backgrounds on which they cast their shadows. One of the most sprawling and substantial works to have come out of the new space opera movement is Scottish writer Ian M. Banks' Culture series. Banks was one of Britain's leading literary writers before he began writing science fiction in 1987. His 10-book Culture series is about a galaxy-spanning anarchist civilization called the Culture. The first two Culture novels were reworkings of earlier sci-fi novels that Banks was unable to publish early in his career. The series imagines a post-scarcity society, which for humans could be called a type of utopia, with many administrative tasks for the running of the Culture being given over to the immensely powerful artificial intelligences known as the Minds. The first in the series, Consider Phlebas, was published in 1987, and many see the story as a clear effort to reinvent some aspects of the classic space opera. There are enormous world-sized spaceships, galaxy-spanning wars, space pirates and alien planets, all in solidly invented futures with morally ambiguous characters, complex political and social issues, and endless new ideas densely packed into every page. The title of the book was borrowed from T.S. Eliot's poem The Waste Land. A section in the poem called Death by Water describes the death, by water, of a sailor named Phlebas. Consider Phlebas was once handsome and tall as you, it says. In the novels, Banks opens the book with a mercenary named Hawser, a genetically engineered changer who can alter his shape at will, confronting death as he's condemned to drown in sewage. The story grows more intricate as it goes on, and what becomes clear is Banks wants to avoid at all costs the clichés of classic space opera, things like galactic empires and corporate competition for resources. Consider Phlebas introduces us to Banks' culture, and from there he goes on to examine themes like the moral responsibility and consequences of the culture's meddling in the development of other civilizations. Use of Weapons, the third book published in the series, which is regarded by many as one of the best, deals with the culture's own guilt and responsibility over its measured manoeuvrings of less sophisticated societies, and features an innovative narrative with alternating chapters telling one story in chronological order and a story that runs parallel but in reverse chronological order. With each new book in the series, Banks reveals further details about the culture's society. In Accession, published in 1996, the story focuses largely on the minds that maintain the culture, as they contend with a strange alien artifact. In what's thought to be his final interview before he died, Banks freely admitted to The Guardian that he enjoyed writing his science fiction novels more than his literary novels, and he said that he had no desire to tie up the novels in the culture in a nice, satisfying ending. He said, "Just like the culture itself is determined to keep on going, refusing to sublimate or disappear off stage, so I think it would be too easy for me to lob in a series ender. To that extent, destroying the whole universe, an always tempting scenario when you realise in science fiction you can do anything, just seems too easy." He went on to say that if you're going to write what a friend of a friend called made up space shit, then if it's going to have any ring of truth, that means sometimes some of the horrible characters get to live, and for there to be any sense of jeopardy, especially in the future novels, the good people have to die. Sometimes. Tellingly, this is one of the major differences between classic and new space opera. It's without the pretense of forced optimism. By the mid-1990s, it was evident that writers considered the new space opera to be the way to approach science fiction that gave them the freedom to create a new direction for the genre by revisiting classic sci-fi material. This gave rise to authors like Dan Simmons, whose 4 epic novels known as the Hyperion Cantos, published between 1989 and 1997, and which I often rave about on this channel, are thought to have brought a literary sensibility to far-flung futures. Simmons went on to write more epic sci-fi with space opera elements in the 2 fantastic and sadly often forgotten novels Ilium and Olympus in 2003 and 2005. These retell Homer's Iliad as far-flung future sci-fi, complete with references to Shakespeare and Proust as well as Homer. Ilium centres on 3 plotlines. One that follows a 20th century scholar whose duty is to compare the events of the Iliad to the reenacted events of the Trojan War. A group of humans from Earth, thousands of years in the future, and the Moravec, robots Manmut and Orphu of Io, who originate from the Jovian system. Much like Simmons' Hyperion, the 3 groups of characters' stories are told over the course of the novel and begin to converge as the climax nears. Simmons is a master at showing exactly how the magnitude of the new space opera remains just as immense as the classic. Stephen Baxter's Zeely sequence covers the span of the entire universe, from the beginning right to the end. Then we have the series of books set in Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space universe. These are dense with concepts like billion-year-old wars, artificial worlds, alien mind parasites, doomsday machines, neutron star computers, sentient oceans, transforming plagues, ancient cataclysms, clones, starships, underground cities, alien artifacts, and more. Sorry guys, just need to breathe. The stories in the series cover tens of thousands of years of history, and they are immense. The first book in the series, Revelation Space, weaves 3 narrative strands that merge as the novel progresses, involving an archaeologist excavating the remains of a long-dead race, the crew of an interstellar ship, and an assassin. It deals with concepts on a colossal scale, such as the shrouds, for example, which are enormous regions of artificially created space-time. For anyone who can survive the edges to explore the shroud, a region known as Revelation Space lies within, where they're imparted with visions and bestowed great knowledge. I couldn't make a video on new space opera without mentioning Peter F. Hamilton, although interestingly some regard many of his works as resembling classic space opera more than new space opera. His vastly successful novels, set in his Confederation universe and his Commonwealth universe, began with the reality dysfunction in 1996 and are considered by many to clearly celebrate the scope and ambition of the classic space opera while also incorporating new space opera elements. The first in his Commonwealth series, Pandora's Star, takes place in 2380, where humanity has colonised over 600 planets, all interlinked by wormholes. With Earth at its centre, the intersolar Commonwealth has grown into a quiet, wealthy society, where rejuvenation allows its citizens to live for centuries by both rejuvenating their bodies and transferring their memories into clones. When an astronomer observes a star over 1,000 light years away vanish, imprisoned inside a force field of immense size, the Commonwealth is anxious to discover what actually happened. So it appears we've moved on drastically from trying to eschew the classic space opera and have instead embraced it, not only as a part of science fiction's past, but as a way of writing that transcends an epoch of time, much like cyberpunk and dystopian stories have. We can see this in more recent novels like the Expanse series by James A. Corey, Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, and works from Adrian Tchaikovsky such as Children of Time. The evolution of the new space opera suggests that science fiction is not a single static thing, but that, like science itself, consists of changing elements, including how it views not only the future, but its own past as well. Perhaps the classic space opera still has something useful to impart to the gritty new space opera, and even whatever might come beyond that. Thanks for watching guys, don't forget to comment, like and subscribe. Until next time guys, happy reading.